The crash of shattering porcelain froze mid-echo when a small hand brushed the sleeve of Hajun's tailored coat. In an instant, the violence inside the restaurant collapsed into silence, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. The boy stood there, 7 years old, barely reaching the Mafia boss's waist, his small frame swallowed by the towering tattooed silhouette he had just dared to interrupt. Overturned tables lay like casualties around them. Hajun's men froze, hands hovering near concealed weapons, unsure whether to laugh or kill. Yechan didn't speak. Instead, his hands rose. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. His fingers moved with a calm, rhythmic precision, carving a message into the heavy silence. One that did not belong in this place, or in this time. The tiger sleeps when the crane sings. The air didn't just chill. It died. Hajun's eyes hardened, then fractured. 20 years collapsed into a single breath. No one alive was supposed to know those words. Words shared only with a brother long buried. Yet the boy held his gaze, steady and unafraid. As Hajun realized the impossible, this silent child was holding a secret powerful enough to shatter his empire. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The heavy silence in the room was brittle, a thin sheet of ice ready to shatter under the weight of Hajun's next breath. His men stood like statues, their confusion masked by professional stoicism, though their eyes flickered toward the boy. No one touched Hajun. No one interrupted his business. And certainly, no one spoke to him in the dead language of a ghost. Hajun's hand, scarred across the knuckles and worth more in blood than the restaurant was worth in one, slowly rose. With a single sharp flick of his wrist, he motioned toward the door. Out, he murmured. The word was low, a vibration more than a sound, but it carried the absolute weight of a death sentence for anyone who disobeyed. Boss. Daisham stepped forward, his brow furrowing. The debt collection isn't. Hajun's gaze snapped to his lieutenant, cold and sharp as a jagged piece of glass. I said out. All of you. Clear the perimeter. If so much as a fly enters this room before I am finished, you will answer to me personally. The scrape of boots on the floor was the only sound as the black-suited men retreated, pulling the heavy glass doors shut behind them. The closed sign rattled against the pane. Now it was only the Titan and the child, separated by a table covered in a cheap, checkered cloth and the lingering scent of spilled tea. Hajun pulled out a chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He didn't loom over Yechan. Instead he sat, bringing his eyes level with the boys. Up close, the child's composure was even more unsettling. Yechan didn't have the frantic energy of a victim. He had the watchful stillness of an old soul. Hajun rested his large hands on the table. He looked at his own fingers, then back at Yechan's small, still hands. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a memory of a time before he was a king of shadows, when a younger brother had used those same signs to tell him he was scared of the dark. That sign, Hajun said, his voice stripped of its usual iron. The tiger and the crane. Where did you see it? Yechan didn't blink. His hands lifted again, fluid and precise. From the lady with the white heart, he signed. She said a great man once lived by those words. She said if the tiger ever came to the garden, I should remind him of the song. Hajun's jaw tightened so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. That specific phrasing, the tiger in the garden, wasn't just a code. It was a plea for mercy his brother had written in a final blood-stained letter Hajun had kept locked in a safe for 2 decades. Who is she, Yechan? Hajun asked, his voice cracking slightly. He leaned forward, his intimidating aura replaced by a desperate, hungry curiosity. The woman who taught you to speak with your hands. Is she here? Yechan pointed a small, steady finger toward the kitchen door, where the sound of muffled sobbing had finally ceased, replaced by a terrifying, watchful silence. Tell me the truth, Hajun whispered, his eyes searching the boy's face for a lie he knew he wouldn't find. Does she know who I am? Yechan tilted his head, a ghost of a sad smile touching his lips. He signed one last thing before the kitchen door creaked open. She knows you are the one who forgot. Hajun stayed frozen in his chair, the most powerful man in the district suddenly feeling like a lost boy. As a woman stepped out of the shadows, her eyes reflecting a past he thought he had buried in the dirt. The kitchen door creaked on rusted hinges, a high-pitched protest that felt like a scream in the heavy air of the dining room. From the darkness of the industrial kitchen, a woman stepped into the pale light of the fluorescent overheads. She was thin, her apron stained with the honest work of a long day, and her hair was pulled back in a way that highlighted the exhaustion etched into her features. Yet, as she moved toward Yechan, she didn't walk with the gait of a victim. She walked with the protective grace of a lioness. Hajun felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't stand, he couldn't. His legs felt like lead as his mind raced back 20 years, flipping through the mental pages of a letter that had been his only comfort and his greatest curse. "There is a woman here, brother," the letter had read, penned in his brother's shaky, dying hand. "A nurse with eyes like the morning sea. She doesn't see a criminal. She sees a man. If I don't make it, find the one who kept the crane singing when the tiger was tired." Hajun stared at her, his sharp predatory eyes softening into a look of agonized disbelief. The woman reached Yechan, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. She looked at the overturned tables, the shattered porcelain, and then finally she looked at Hajun. There was no terror in her gaze, only a weary, profound sadness. "You've grown into the man he feared you would become," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a gavel. "Or perhaps you've just become the man the world forced you to be." Hajun, hearing his name from her lips, sent a shiver through his spine. He hadn't been Hajun to anyone in years. He was chairman, boss, or the reaper. To hear it spoken with such quiet familiarity felt like a blade slipping between his ribs. "Minna," Hajun whispered, the name tasting like ash and old memories. "Is it really you?" After the hospital in Busan, we were told everyone in that wing was lost. I searched for months. I burnt half the city down looking for a trace of the woman who held my brother's hand when I couldn't. Minna tightened her grip on Yechan. "I didn't want to be found by the man who chose the sword over the soul." "Hajun, your brother's last wish wasn't for you to find me to pay a debt. It was for you to leave the life that was killing him. But looking at your suit, your men, and the way my son had to sign a dead man's code just to keep you from breaking our home, I see you didn't listen." Hajun looked down at his hands, hands that had built an empire of fear. For the first time, the weight of his gold watch and the silk of his sleeves felt suffocating. He looked at Yechan, who was watching the exchange with that same unsettling wide-eyed calm. The boy was the living image of the brother Hajun had lost. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant tilt of the chin. "He's his son, isn't he?" Hajun asked, his voice barely audible. Minna didn't answer with words. She simply pulled a small, silver locket from beneath her shirt and opened it. Inside wasn't a photo, but a pressed, dried flower, a crane flower, and a small scrap of paper with the same tiger and crane seal Hajun wore on his signet ring. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The debt he had come to collect wasn't just a mistake, it was a sacrilege. He wasn't just destroying a restaurant. He was dismantling the only sanctuary left for his own blood. The boy wasn't just a messenger. Yechan was the legacy he thought had died in a hospital bed 2 decades ago. Hajun stood up slowly, his shadow stretching long across the floor. But for the first time in his life, he didn't use his height to intimidate. He bowed his head, a gesture of absolute submission that would have sent shockwaves through the underworld if his men had seen it. "I didn't know," Hajun said, his voice thick with a vow. "I swear to the heavens, Minna, I didn't know. But I know now." The cold night air did little to cool the fire burning in Hajun's chest as he stepped out of the restaurant. He didn't look at the line of black sedans or the dozen men standing at attention. He walked straight to the lead car, his movements predatory and precise. Behind him, the small restaurant remained dark, a fragile island in a sea of concrete. But in his mind, the image of Yechan's steady hands was burned like a brand. "To the district office," Hajun commanded as he slid into the leather interior. Now, Daisham sat in the front passenger seat, his silhouette rigid. "Boss," the woman The boy. Do we need to send a cleanup crew to finish the eviction? I can have the bulldozers there by dawn. Hajun's eyes remained fixed on the passing city lights, his reflection in the window looking like a stranger's. Touch one brick of that building, Daeshim, and I will bury you under it. I want the original ledgers for the Bukgu district, not the digital summaries, the handwritten collection books. A flicker of hesitation crossed Daeshim's face, a microscopic twitch of the jaw that Hajun caught in the rearview mirror. Those are in the deep vault, Chairman. It'll take time to. I have nothing but time, Hajun interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous silken whisper. An hour later, in the sterile high-tech silence of his private office, Hajun spread the heavy leather-bound books across a mahogany desk. He ignored the millions of won flowing through his gambling dens and shipping docks. Instead, he traced his finger down the small-scale collection lists, the neighborhood taxes that his organization extracted from the local shops. He found the entry for the restaurant. His eyes narrowed. The ledger showed a debt that had tripled in less than 6 months. Interest rates that exceeded even his own ruthless standards were scrawled in the margins. But as he looked closer at the ink, his blood turned to ice. The signatures authorizing the emergency loans weren't in Minna's handwriting. They were clumsy imitations, frantic attempts to make a robbery look like a contract. Even more damning was the destination of the payments. In the master ledger, the restaurant was marked as defaulted/uncollectible. But in the subledger, a hidden book Hajun had pulled from Daeshim's personal drawer, the money was still being squeezed out, month after month, diverted into a private offshore account Hajun didn't recognize. Daeshim hadn't been collecting for the organization. He had been cannibalizing it. He had targeted a widow and a silent child, using Hajun's name as a shield to line his own pockets, knowing that a woman in hiding would never go to the police and a mafia boss would never look at an insignificant noodle shop. Hajun leaned back, the leather creaking under him. He felt a sickening wave of guilt. For years, he had prided himself on being a man of honor among thieves, a tiger who only hunted worthy prey. Yet, under his watch, his most trusted lieutenant had turned him into a scavenger, a monster who was unknowingly starving his own brother's family. The betrayal was bitter, but the realization of his own blindness was worse. He had been so focused on the horizon that he hadn't noticed the rot at his feet. He reached for the internal intercom, his finger hovering over the button. He could end Daeshim with a single word. But death was too simple for a man who had made his family cry. He needed the traitor to feel the walls closing in, just as Minna had felt them. Daeshim, Hajun said into the speaker, his voice devoid of any emotion. Come in here. I want to talk about the audit you performed on the restaurant. Bring your personal files. I want to see exactly how much you think they owe us. As he waited for the door to open, Hajun adjusted his cufflink, the one shaped like a crane. The tiger wasn't just awake, it was hunting. The morning sun struggled to pierce the soot-stained windows of the restaurant, casting long dusty fingers across the floor. Hajun had nearly ordered his men to tear up just 48 hours prior. The bell above the door chimed, a lonely tinny sound that made Minna freeze behind the counter, her hand tightening around a damp rag. She expected the black suits, the heavy boots, and the cold demands of the previous visit. Instead, she found Hajun standing alone. He was still dressed in a suit that cost more than her entire inventory, but he had left his coat and his entourage in the car. Beside him stood a woman carrying a sleek, professional briefcase. A stranger with kind eyes and a quiet manner that didn't belong in the world of debt collection. Hajun didn't speak at first. He walked to the same table where he had sat with Yechan, his gaze lingering on the boy who was tucked into a corner booth, intently folding a piece of scrap paper into the shape of a bird. Hajun's presence usually sucked the air out of a room, but today, he seemed to be holding his breath, as if the slightest sudden movement might shatter the fragile piece he was trying to build. I am not here for the ledger, Hajun said, his voice unusually raspy. He looked at Minna, then gestured to the woman beside him. This is Dr. Han. She is the foremost specialist in the country for pediatric linguistics and auditory technology. Minna's face went pale, a mixture of hope and defensive terror. We can't afford specialists, Hajun. If this is another way to increase the debt. The debt is dead, Hajun interrupted, his tone final. It has been erased from every book I own. This isn't a transaction, Minna. It is a restitution. Dr. Han stepped forward, kneeling by the booth where Yechan sat. With a gentle smile she opened her case, revealing a pair of devices so small and sophisticated they looked like shimmering pearls. They weren't the bulky, buzzing aids Minna had seen in brochures years ago. They were miracles of engineering, designed to translate the world into a language Yechan's nerves could finally understand. Hajun watched from the periphery, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. He felt like an intruder in his own life. As the doctor began to work, using soft signs to explain her intent to the boy, the restaurant became a cathedral of held breaths. Yechan, the doctor signaled. Can you hear the tiger's heart? She adjusted the frequency on a tablet, her stylus moving with surgical precision. A soft chime echoed from the device. Yechan's entire body jolted. His wide eyes, usually so composed and still, began to dart around the room as if he were seeing color for the first time. He looked at the humming refrigerator. He looked at the distant sound of a car horn outside. Then, his gaze snapped to his mother, who had let the rag fall to the floor, her hands pressed against her mouth. The boy let out a small huffing sound, a gasp that had no words but carried the weight of 7 years of silence. Hajun felt a crack in the icy armor he had spent 20 years forging. It wasn't a loud break but a slow, painful thawing. He saw Yechan look at him, not with the dead man's code in his eyes, but with a raw, vibrating curiosity. The boy reached up, touching the edge of his ear, and then he did something that Hajun hadn't prepared for. He signed, "Thank you, Uncle." The word uncle hit Hajun harder than any bullet ever had. He turned away abruptly, walking toward the window to stare at the street, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He was a man who dealt in blood and territory, a man who commanded silence through fear. But in this small, crumbling kitchen, he had just realized that the most powerful thing he could ever own was the sound of a child finally hearing his mother's voice. "This is only the beginning," Hajun murmured, his back still turned, his eyes fixed on a black sedan parked across the street, Daisham's car. The gift was a peace offering, but the war for this family's safety was only just starting. The shadows inside Daisham's private office felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, and the cold sweat of a man who knew the floor was disappearing beneath his feet. He stared at the security footage on his monitor, grainy black and white images of Hajun entering that pathetic noodle shop without his guards. He saw the specialist enter with her silver briefcase. He saw the chairman of the most ruthless syndicate in the country sitting on a cheap wooden chair, as if it were a throne of gold. Daisham's fingers drummed a frantic, uneven beat on his desk. He wasn't a fool. He knew that Hajun's sudden fascination with the boy wasn't just a whim, it was an investigation. The ledger he had spent years falsifying was a masterpiece of deception, but it was a paper wall and Hajun was a wrecking ball. Once the boss realized that the restitution he was paying was actually a recovery of stolen blood money, there would be no trial. There would only be a shallow grave in the hills of Incheon. "The boy," Daisham hissed to the empty room. "It all comes back to the boy." Yechan was the bridge. As long as that child could sign his stories and hear the truth, Hajun would keep digging. If the boy disappeared, if the restaurant and everyone in it were erased in a single tragic accident, the trail would go cold. Hajun would be devastated, perhaps even more unstable, but the evidence of Daisham's decade-long embezzlement would burn with the kitchen grease. He picked up a burner phone, his movements jerky and desperate. He couldn't use the regular crew. They were too loyal to the chairman's cult of personality. He needed the scavengers, the remnant boys who worked the docks and didn't care whose blood they spilled as long as the envelope was thick enough. "I have a job," Daisham said into the phone, his voice a jagged edge of its former self. The restaurant on the corner of 4th and Bukgu. It needs to go dark. Permanently. No witnesses. Especially not the kid. He hung up, the silence of the room rushing back in to suffocate him. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window. He had served Hajun for 15 years, standing in the spray of blood and the heat of the fire, waiting for his turn to lead. He had told himself he was just taking his commission, a tax for his loyalty. But Hajun's sudden pivot toward morality was a threat to everything Daesham had built. In his mind, he justified the coming violence. The tiger is growing old, he thought, trying to steady his trembling hands. He's letting a child pull his whiskers. If I don't kill the boy, the chairman's weakness will kill us all. He stood up and straightened his tie, the silk feeling like a noose. He had to play the part of the loyal lieutenant for just one more night. He would stand by Hajun's side, nod at his orders, and wait for the call that the problem had been liquidated. As he walked out of his office, he passed a mirror and practiced his mask, the calm, stoic expression of a man who had everything under control. But beneath the expensive fabric of his suit, his heart was a trapped bird, fluttering against the ribs of a man who had already crossed the point of no return. The storm was coming, and Daesham had decided that if he was going down, he would make sure the tiger's garden was the first thing to burn. The sky over Seoul didn't just break. It collapsed. A torrential downpour turned the neon lights of Bukgu into blurry smears of violet and red, and the thunder rolled through the narrow alleys like the growl of a subterranean beast. Inside the restaurant, the air was warm and smelled of toasted sesame and rain-damp wood. Yechon sat by the window, his new hearing aids catching the rhythmic, percussive drumming of the water against the glass. For the first time in his life, the storm had a voice. Minna was wiping down the counter, her eyes drifting frequently to the door. Hajun had left an hour ago, summoned to an urgent council meeting on the other side of the Han River, a diversion Daesham had orchestrated with surgical precision. The street outside was deserted, the usual foot traffic driven away by the biting wind and the sheet-like rain. Then the umbrellas appeared. They emerged from the darkness like a line of black fins cutting through deep water. One, then three, then a dozen. They didn't move like customers seeking shelter. They moved with a synchronized predatory intent, fanning out to cover the front entrance and the narrow service alley. The men beneath them were shadows in dark ponchos, their faces obscured by the obsidian domes of their umbrellas and the relentless spray of the storm. Minna froze, the rags slipping from her numb fingers. She recognized the gait of these men, the heavy, deliberate footfalls of the scavenger crews. They were the ones who did the work the higher-ups didn't want to see. Yechon, she whispered, though the boy was already looking. He had seen the reflection in the window. He didn't panic. His wide eyes simply fixed on the lead figure standing directly under the street lamp. The man didn't move, but the light glinted off the long, curved blade of a kitchen knife tucked against his forearm. The restaurant's power flickered once, twice, and then died, plunged into a suffocating gloom. The only light now came from the rhythmic strobing of lightning, illuminating the line of black umbrellas as they closed the circle. The front door groaned as a heavy shoulder slammed against it, the closed sign rattling violently against the glass. Minna lunged across the floor, scooping Yechon into her arms. "The cellar," she breathed against his ear, her voice trembling. "Yechon, listen to me. You have to go to the cellar and find the crawl space behind the flour sacks. Do not come out until you hear the tiger sing. Do you understand?" Yechon looked at her, his small hands coming up to sign, but the restaurant's front window suddenly exploded inward. A spray of glass shards rained down like diamonds in the dark. A man stepped through the frame, his black umbrella discarded on the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the boy with a hollow, mercenary coldness. The storm roared into the room through the broken pane, bringing with it the smell of ozone and wet asphalt. Minna backed away, pulling Yechon toward the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the line of umbrellas didn't waver. They stood like sentinels, ensuring that no one escaped and no one saw what was happening inside the sanctuary. Daesham's orders had been clear. Leave nothing but ash. As the first of the men vaulted over the counter, the metal scrape of blades drawing from leather sheaths echoed the thunder above. The restaurant, once a place of healing, had become a cage. And the tiger was miles away, oblivious to the fact that his garden was being trampled by the very boots he had bought for his men. The darkness in the kitchen was thick and tasted of old iron and fear. Lightning strobed through the service hatch, casting jagged skeletal shadows of hanging ladles against the walls. Minna's breath was a series of panicked hitches, her body shaking so violently she could barely stand. But as a heavy boot crunched on the broken glass in the dining room, she felt a small firm hand take hers. Yechon didn't tremble. He moved with a supernatural calmness, his bare feet making no sound on the linoleum floor. He knew this building better than the men currently stalking through it. He had spent 7 years navigating its silence, learning the language of its creaks and the geography of its shadows. He led his mother toward the back of the pantry, past the towering stacks of rice, to a heavy wooden cabinet that looked like a permanent part of the wall. With a strength born of pure necessity, Yechon pulled a hidden latch behind the spice rack. The back of the cabinet swung inward, revealing a crawl space originally built for old plumbing. A space so narrow it was invisible to anyone who didn't know the building's skeletal secrets. He pushed his mother inside. Minna tried to pull him in with her, her eyes wide with terror, but Yechon shook his head. He reached out and touched the hearing aid behind his ear, then gently tapped his mother's lips. His hands moved in the dim light, his signs sharp and clear. The crane must hide the nest. I am small. I can move. You stay. He signed one last thing, the movement of his hands almost like a prayer. Stay quiet. Before she could protest, he eased the cabinet door shut, the click of the latch swallowed by a timely roll of thunder. He was alone in the kitchen now. The heavy swinging doors to the dining area creaked open, and the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping over the stainless steel prep tables. Find them, a gravelly voice commanded. The boss said the woman and the brat are here somewhere. Check the cold storage. Yechon dropped to his stomach. He slid under the low lip of the industrial dishwasher, his small frame disappearing into the grease-licked shadows just as the light passed over his hiding spot. He watched the boots of the men, heavy, mud-caked, and alien, as they stomped through his home. The scavengers began to tear the kitchen apart. They threw pots to the floor and kicked in the doors of the walk-in freezer, the metal clanging like funeral bells. Yechon stayed perfectly still, his heart a frantic drum against the cold floor. But his mind was focused on the rhythm of the storm outside. He wasn't just hiding, he was listening. Through his new ears he could hear the distinct sound of the front door being forced again. But this time the footsteps were different. They weren't the heavy, disorganized thags of the mercenaries. They were the measured, heavy strikes of a man who walked as if he owned the earth beneath him. A whistle pierced the air. A sharp melodic sound that rose above the roar of the rain. It was the call of a bird, out of place and haunting. The men in the kitchen froze. What was that? One of them whispered, his hand tightening on his blade. Yechon knew that sound. It was the crane's song, the signal his mother had told him about. He stayed in the shadows, watching as the flashlight beam began to shake in the mercenary's hand. The hunters had just realized they were no longer the only predators in the room. In the darkness of the pantry, Yechon closed his eyes and waited for the tiger to arrive. The front doors of the restaurant didn't just open. They were eclipsed. A silhouette stood framed by a jagged arc of lightning, the torrential rain cascading off the brim of a black umbrella that Hajun held with terrifying stillness. He stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes crunching on the glass he had once threatened to break. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He simply closed the umbrella and leaned it against the wall, the click of the metal echoing like the cocking of a hammer. The mercenaries in the dining room scrambled, their flashlights dancing frantically across the peeling wallpaper until they landed on the chairman. "Boss!" one of them stammered, his knife lowering instinctively. We were told the debt needed clearing," Dashim said. Hajun's eyes weren't human. They were voids of obsidian, cold and bottomless. Daisham is a dead man walking, he said. His voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. And you are the dirt I will use to bury him. The first man lunged, driven by the panicked realization that there was no mercy to be found in Hajun's silence. Hajun moved like smoke. He didn't waste a single motion. He caught the man's wrist, the sound of snapping bone puncturing the roar of the thunder, and redirected the mercenary's own momentum into the edge of a heavy oak table. The man went down without a sound, his forehead hitting the wood with a dull final thud. In the kitchen, Yechan watched through the gap beneath the dishwasher. He saw the tiger move, not with the clumsy rage of the men who had invaded his home, but with a terrifying rhythmic precision. 3 more men rushed from the shadows of the bar, their blades glinting in the strobing light. Hajun didn't flinch. He used the very environment he had once intended to destroy as his weapon. He swung a heavy metal chair with a grace that was almost balletic, shattering a man's ribs before spinning to catch another in the throat with the edge of his palm. This wasn't a fight, it was an execution. It was a methodical dismantling of everything that had dared to threaten the garden he had sworn to protect. The lead scavenger, a man twice Hajun's width, backed away toward the kitchen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached into his belt and pulled a snub-nosed revolver, his hand shaking so violently the barrel tapped against his knuckles. "Stay back. I'll kill the kid. I know he's in here." Hajun stopped. He stood in the center of the ruined dining room, surrounded by the groaning bodies of the fallen, his suit still impeccably sharp despite the spray of crimson across his white shirt. He looked toward the kitchen, and for a split second, his eyes softened, searching for a sign. From the darkness beneath the dishwasher, a small hand emerged. Yechan didn't reach for help. He raised 2 fingers and tapped them against his palm, the sign for watch. Hajun's gaze snapped back to the gunman. A predatory smile devoid of any warmth touched his lips. "The boy isn't afraid of you," Hajun whispered, stepping into the light of a lightning strike. "He knows the difference between a scavenger and a king." Before the man could pull the trigger, Hajun launched a heavy ceramic teapot, the very one Yechan had used to serve him tea, with the force of a projectile. It shattered against the gunman's face in a spray of white shards and cold dregs. As the man stumbled, Hajun was on him, his hands closing around the man's throat with the finality of a steel trap. The struggle lasted only seconds. When the last of the traitors lay still on the linoleum, Hajun stood in the absolute silence of the storm's wake. He smoothed his tie, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He didn't look at the carnage. He looked at the kitchen cabinet where a small dark-haired boy was crawling out of the shadows, his wide eyes reflecting the man who had finally become the guardian he was meant to be. The scent of fresh paint and wood polish had finally replaced the lingering odor of ozone and old smoke. The restaurant sat on the corner of the Buku district like a lantern in the dusk, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting amber light that seemed to push back the encroaching shadows of the city. The broken glass had been replaced with reinforced panes, and the dented tables were gone, substituted by heavy, hand-carved mahogany that spoke of a permanence this neighborhood had never known. Beside the front door, bolted firmly into the brickwork, was a small unassuming plaque made of solid brass. It didn't bear a name or a warning in words. Instead, it featured a minimalist engraving of a crane perched atop a sleeping tiger, the golden seal. To the average passerby, it was a beautiful piece of art. To the underworld of Seoul, it was a holy boundary. To cross that threshold with ill intent was to invite the wrath of a man who had rediscovered his soul and was prepared to kill to keep it clean. Inside, the clatter of porcelain was a happy sound. Minna moved between the tables with a lightness in her step that had been missing for 20 years. She was no longer a woman hiding in the tall grass. She was the proprietor of a sanctuary. Across the street, buried in the deep velvet shadows of a parked black sedan, Hajun sat in silence. He didn't wear his suit jacket today. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the intricate tattoos that told the story of his violent past, now partially obscured by the darkness. He watched the steam rise from the bowls of noodles, and the way the locals bowed to Minna with genuine respect. He had dismantled Daesham's faction with the same cold efficiency he had once used to build it, but he had kept the details of that bloodletting far away from this corner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, the original scrap of the Tiger and Crane Code. He looked at it for a moment before flicking a gold lighter and watching the paper curl into ash in the tray. The debt was finally truly paid. The restaurant door opened, and Yechon stepped out onto the sidewalk to bring in the chalkboard menu for the night. The boy looked taller, his shoulders more set, no longer dwarfed by the world's noise. He adjusted the pearl-colored devices behind his ears, tilting his head as if catching the melody of the city's evening hum. Before turning to go back inside, Yechon paused. He looked directly across the street, his gaze piercing through the tinted glass of the sedan with the same unsettling wide-eyed clarity he had shown on that first terrifying day. He didn't run and he didn't hide. Instead, he raised a small steady hand and moved his fingers in a slow deliberate sign. "Everything is loud now," he signed, a mischievous spark in his eyes. "Thank you for the music." Then with a final energetic wave, the boy ducked back inside and closed the door, the golden seal gleaming one last time under the street lamp. Hajun felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest. A quiet thrum of peace that no amount of territory or gold could ever buy. He tapped the glass of the window twice, a silent salute to the nephew who had saved him from himself. "Drive," Hajun murmured to the driver. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the sea of red taillights. The boss was returning to the shadows of his empire, but he left the light on behind him. The tiger was no longer hunting. He was watching the gate, ensuring that for one small boy and his mother, the crane would never have to stop singing again. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.